Hi, this is Andy from Business Minded. There's been increasing visibility in mindfulness in recent years. The practice, which is of course drawn from Eastern philosophies, has been extensively researched by the scientific community and is now widely used in the treatment of stress and depression. The bestseller, Mindfulness, A Practical Guide to Finding Peace in a Frantic World, by Mark Williams and Danny Penman, is arguably the reason that mindfulness has seen such a surge of interest. But it's not only in clinical settings where mindfulness is being applied. Increasingly forward-thinking companies, such as Reebok, Google, and AstraZeneca, are implementing mindful practices in the workplace. And studies have shown that in the context of business, mindfulness delivers benefits across a number of areas, including leadership, customer service, productivity, and staff well-being. The recent report by the Mindfulness All-Party Parliamentary Group highlighted the role of mindfulness in the workplace and provided a number of recommendations relating to mindfulness and UK businesses. This presentation, which runs for about 12 minutes, will go through some of the areas of mindfulness relevant to business, touching on how the brain that nature has given us operates, how mindfulness helps us address some of the challenges that come along with that, and how mindfulness is being applied in a number of different businesses. Through evolution, nature has handed us a brain that essentially has three parts. The reptilian, or lizard brain, is essentially fight or flight, and it operates on autopilot. The mammalian brain, which takes in emotions, habits, and decision-making, and the neocortex, the human brain, which is the newest part of our brain and gives us language, imagination, and the ability to reason. And of course, it's the interplay between these different parts of the brain which make us the complex, thinking and feeling creatures that we are now. Our brains can form habits, and of course that's useful to us. Continually scanning the horizon for a predator is, obviously, a good survival mechanism. In a modern context, habit forming can be useful to us as well. We don't really want to be thinking of every single little action that we undertake, for example, when we drive to work in the morning. Of course, habits can be less than useful to us. We can form bad habits, and we form habits around the way that we think. We often end up telling ourselves the same stories or thinking in the same ways. Our thinking tends to go off along well-trodden paths within our minds. Our human brains allow us to consider events beyond the here and now. We mull things over from the past, imagine the future, and consider things which may or may not happen at all. This is called stimulus-independent thought, or mind wandering, and it's believed that mind wandering is essentially our default state. Our minds try to make sense of the world by picking up on tiny pieces of information and trying to make a coherent picture. So we check in with past experiences, compare them to now, and extrapolate them out into the future. And we do this habitually. We do it very, very quickly and without conscious thought. The newer parts of our brain don't act in isolation. The older fight or flight elements, the reptilian brain, comes into play too, as of course does the body itself. So our experiences are rarely about thinking in isolation. Our thoughts drive our moods and result in sensations in the body. And similarly, sensations in the body can affect our moods and so drive our thoughts. And these continue to feed back on one another, feeding new thoughts, new sensations, feelings, and impulses to action. So when you consider our tendency to habitual thinking, our ability to travel backwards and forwards in our minds, to imagine, to interpret, to worry, coupled with a complex interplay between thoughts, feelings, impulses, and bodily sensations, it's easy to see how the brain that nature has given us can run away within itself. A brief, unresourceful thought taking us down spirals in our minds, creating a vicious circle, leading to ever more self-defeating and self-attacking ways of thinking. And sometimes we can find that the way we relate to ourselves in the privacy of our minds can be horrendously critical and extremely unresourceful. We may get hung up on our thoughts, believing them to be true, believing them to be who we are. And we can find ourselves in a very unpleasant way of thinking without realizing quite how we'd got there. But of course, it isn't our fault. It's simply down to the complexities of the brain that nature has given us. Mindfulness enables us to take a step back from our habitual way of thinking, to observe what is happening in this moment, and to do so without getting captured in the spiral of thinking that may otherwise trap us. It teaches us that we're not our thoughts or emotions. We can have choice on how we react in situations where thoughts, feelings, and sensations arise. It gives us another way to be with our thinking. Science has demonstrated that by practicing mindfulness, we can make structural changes to our brains and the way in which our minds habitually operate. Historically, it was thought that our brains were fixed, that the number of cells and the overall structure was defined at an early stage, and that was that, aside from some erosion of cells as we got older, or perhaps as a result of degenerative diseases. But advances in neuroscience has demonstrated that this isn't actually the case. Neuroplasticity is the process by which our brains essentially change shape, developing new pathways between the neurons. And neurogenesis describes the way in which we actually grow new brain cells. Research is continuing to show that practicing mindfulness makes structural changes to a number of different areas in the brain. We see increased activity and grey matter in areas including the left hippocampus, which is associated with learning and emotional regulation, the prefrontal cortex, which governs working memory, concentration, and decision-making, and the temporal parietal junction, which is the area of the brain related to taking perspective, having empathy and compassion. We see a reduction in activity and the amount of grey matter in other areas of the brain. For example, the amygdala. This is the fight or flight center responsible for fear, anxiety, and stress. And a reduction in size and activity in the amygdala is correlated with a reduction in stress. So what does that mean for us as business professionals? Well, of course, the overarching outputs of practicing mindfulness, a reduction in stress, in rumination, and emotional reactivity, whilst increasing working memory, cognitive flexibility, and well-being, are obviously of interest. And there have been many studies which have looked specifically at how practicing mindfulness impacts in the workplace. And we can consider the benefits of mindfulness within the context of business by looking across a number of areas: developing leadership, supporting change and organizational transformation, employee engagement, employee performance, and staff well-being. A number of studies have shown that there is a correlation between the degree of a leader's mindfulness and the effectiveness of their leadership. Higher mindfulness equating to more effective leadership. Now, of course, there are many dimensions to leadership, and many of the core attributes expected within a good leader are also developed by mindfulness. For example, decision-making, empathy, and emotional regulation. Mindfulness is increasingly a part of leadership development programs and is now being taught at a number of business schools. As yet, there haven't been specific studies into how mindfulness impacts on organizational change programs. However, there is substantial evidence of the positive effect of mindfulness on a number of the attributes which come into play when staff are exposed to significant change. For example, a reduction in rumination, the ability to develop resilience and coping strategies, and to take a more enhanced perspective on situations. There are various research papers published which look specifically at employee engagement and the role of mindful practices. And they've shown that higher mindfulness in employees does lead to greater work engagement. Mindfulness has also been shown to improve interpersonal relationships and job satisfaction. The impact of mindfulness on employee performance is perhaps the area within business which has been most widely researched, and many studies have shown that an increase in employees' mindfulness equates to an increase in employee performance. At a more granular level, through the practice of mindfulness, we see an increase in concentration, substantial increase in productivity, and increases to problem-solving capabilities. Mindfulness has been associated with well-being for some 40 years. MBSR and MBCT developed as treatments for stress, anxiety, and depression. And some of the many well-being benefits relating to mindfulness within the workplace include a decreased risk of burnout, enhancements to the immune system, and so less days off sick, and improvements in work-life balance. Here at Business Minded, we provide evidence-based mindfulness training specifically for the workplace. Our approach is intended to be accessible for staff at all levels and practical within the context of business. We draw on the work of the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, and our approach has been refined over the past 3 years and many successful trainings. If you'd like to find out more about how we can implement mindful practices within your workplace and the trainings that we provide, then simply take a look at the website, make contact through the email there, or sign up for the newsletter, and we'll keep you up to date